Hello everyone. Those of you joining. Just checking you can still hear me, Alice and Emily. Sarah.
Yep.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
All clear.
Or just went completely quiet then.
Which is an awe.
So I've got we're nearly at over 100 attendees now, so I'm going to give it a moment or two for everybody to join us. We'll get going at a couple of minutes past 1 o'clock. For anybody who is joining us, there are captions here. I'm just going to show you the housekeeping slide. There are captions. On your control panel, you should find the CC button and you can switch captions on and off in there. We're also, rather than using chat, for accessibility reasons, we're using the Q&A box. So if you can locate the Q&A box from your control panel, then that's where you can ask us questions or make any comments. And at the moment, if it would be helpful for me, if you could use the Q&A just to tell me that you can hear me and that you found the box. If a few people can do that, then I'll know the technology's working. Great, thank you, Nick, Neil, Mike, Alan, Barbara, et al. Great, I know the technology's working there. And yes, we don't have the chat box in use. Just so that you know, it's because it actually announces all of the information to anybody who's using a screen reader and becomes really confusing. So the Q&A box is a place you can put your questions and we'll attempt to answer them during the session, or also a good way for us to record anything that we didn't get answered during the session. So please use the Q&A box as much as you can to ask questions as we're going along, and then we'll be accumulating those and asking them during the session if we can, and if not, we'll use it to create some FAQs afterwards. So back to the beginning. Welcome everyone. This is Accessible Design for Competitive Advantage, webinar by AbilityNet, with guests from Sarah, Emily and Alice, and myself, Mark Walker from AbilityNet. We'll do some introductions in a moment, but we'll get going in a second. Okay, so welcome to Accessible Design for Competitive Advantage, free AbilityNet webinar. We're going to be working on this for the next 50, 60 minutes together, so please come in and join us. We've got live captions running. As you can see, you can turn those on if you need them by clicking on the CC button within the control panel at your end. If you want slides, you can find them at slideshare.net if you need to follow them for any particular reason. All of the slides we've got here are available through slideshare.net/AbilityNet. We'll make a transcript and a recording available afterwards. So if you do need to take notes or other things, then just be aware we will be doing a roundup at the end and sharing that back onto our website and passing that information back around to anybody who's registered. As I mentioned, please use the Q&A window to ask questions. We don't have the chat live on this session. And there'll be a feedback form at the end that you'll receive after the session, which you can then ask for any further information and any follow-up questions. But we are going to be asking you some questions as we go along, and the panelists are eager to hear your questions and will want to know what you'd like to know. So please do use the Q&A as much as you want. So what we're going to cover today, you'll be aware that the whole COVID crisis has highlighted the importance of meeting the needs of diverse users. There's lots of people who haven't been able to get online because they've gone, a really good example for AbilityNet is that people who've been working from home who had lots of adjustments in the workplace have found themselves at home and faced by a whole new set of circumstances and trying to get online and do their work, for example. But equally, people shopping for the first time from home because they didn't have another option. So we're going to run through some top tips for accessible design to think about how design as a whole process requires you to think about accessibility at every stage. We'll be thinking about older people and disabled people because we've seen them affected most by the COVID situation. In terms of the design of the services they're trying to use, you may have been on the other end of that, trying to redesign your services and enable people who weren't previously common customers of yours, starting to use your services perhaps for the first time and facing issues with that. We'll be highlighting some common issues that can only really be fixed by inclusive design. We'll be talking about what we mean by inclusive design and what processes you can adopt. And we were just discussing this just before you joined us, the career prospects for anybody with accessible design credentials. So why would you personally see this as a competitive advantage, and what can it do for your career? Brief introduction to AbilityNet. We're a charity. We believe in a digital world accessible to all. We have a variety of services that help disabled people and others use technology to achieve their goals at work, at home, and in education. In particular, for this session, it's relevant to talk about our accessibility services. We provide those services to a whole range of different customers, paid for services and some free resources on our website. We also help people in the workplace. We have a whole load of free resources in the form of fact sheets. We also have a volunteer network of over 300 CRB checked volunteers around the country helping older people and disabled people in their homes, currently doing all of that remotely, but typically would do that by going into their homes and helping set their tech up. TechShare Pro is our annual event for the accessibility professional community. That's taking place online this year for obvious reasons in November. Last year was hosted by Google. This year the sponsors are Microsoft. And we bring in a whole international sort of selection of speakers and do some great stuff around bringing the accessibility community together, really. And then we also run the Tech for Good Awards. Currently doing the shortlisting of that right now. The finalists for this year's awards are being announced next week, and the awards themselves will be announced at the end of September. And again, that's all moved online for obvious reasons. So let's start with a poll so we know why you're here. I'm going to launch a poll. There are some interfaces that aren't going to work. So there are some people who are using an online view of the page may not be able to see this, but it'd be interesting for us to know who's here in terms of your role, just because then we can think about some of the content that we're going to pull together over the course of the session. So I can see we've got 150 odd people on the call, and I can see half of you have voted now, so please click away if you can see it. If you can't see it and you can see the Q&A, then just let us know in there, or if you have a role under other that's not answered, then please use the Q&A just to let us know if there's something in particular that you think would be relevant in terms of your current role and what we said we're going to be talking about. A librarian, hi Seth. You work for the local authority web team, a graphic designer, hi Salah, hi Jane. Work for a local authority, library assistant, graphic designer. Great. So this is the right subject for you. This is the right webinar. So that's good. Great. So that looks like it's leveled out. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you briefly and just run through those for. So we've got 8 people who are product designers. We've got 7 product owners. UX, digital content is the individual biggest category that you've identified. Web developers, user researchers, and others, and you've heard some of those names: test engineers, counselor, psychotherapist, program manager, scrum master, local authority website. So a real mix, and I think that's great, because our point is going to be that accessibility is not the responsibility of the accessibility specialist only. It covers a whole range of different roles and responsibilities. So that fits neatly with what we're going to be talking about. So let me introduce the panel. I'm going to get each of you to say a few words. Sarah, if you could tell us a little bit about your role and when people ask you about accessibility, what do you say? What do you describe it as?
Okay. Hello, and thank you for inviting me. This is brilliant. So I currently work for professional Sony at the moment, and I've been there for almost a year as the UX video and design manager. And I've kind of made myself when I first joined, I made myself the unofficial accessibility champion. And it's been recognized now that I can be the accessibility go-to person. And my experience and passion for accessibility started probably about 13, 14 years ago, when I used to work for a small sight loss charity called Living Paintings, and was put in charge of their website and social media channels at the time, and kind of learned from there for working with people, particularly people with sight loss, and working with people that they were able to often read the website quicker than I was using a screen reader, and that for me was it was mind-blowing, really. And then from Living Paintings I moved on to Guide Dogs and was leading the website team there, working really closely with the assistive tech team, which again for me was it was so incredibly helpful to have people on site that you could get experience, you could get feedback, you could have some really in-depth conversations about why we should be making things accessible. Certainly from my perspective, I was always very visual, and sometimes having to make those compromises. We had some brilliant conversations. So yeah, working with the tech team was a great experience. So for me, it's just a passion that's kind of grown from working within that environment and realizing how important accessibility is.
Cool. And Emily, can you tell us a bit about your current role, and your sort of your take on accessibility and inclusive design?
Yeah, of course. So hi, yeah, I'm Emily, UX designer. Thanks for having me. I work at MoneySupermarket Group. So my background in UX was originally self-taught before I came to MoneySupermarket. Been there about 2 years now, and that's actually pretty much the same thing with my background in accessibility. It was a bit self-taught at first. It came about due to like UX colliding with my other passion of advocating for equality and inclusivity, and it's just kind of two things that I've always been quite passionate about. And I became aware of accessibility by going to like meetups around UX, and it's quite often discussed as a topic in the UX community. So that's how I became aware of it. But also by being a member of a employee resource group that we have at MoneySupermarket, which aims on like empowering everyone to be their authentic self at work. And we often run campaigns around gender, race, sexual orientation, and disability as well. So with those kind of two tracks, they kind of ended up merging and overlapping a lot, those two roles, and developing into me kind of, I guess, trying to encourage our colleagues who actually do know a lot about accessibility, but maybe don't believe they do or don't think they do, trying to encourage them to open up and share what they already know, and try and create a culture where we can share that knowledge and we can speak about accessibility when we're ideating or designing, or if we're building or testing, as well as being willing to challenge one another to consider accessibility in those phases, because often it can feel awkward if you ask someone like, have you considered this? And people are like, people panic. So it's just about trying to reduce that almost like fear, and just, yeah, kind of embrace a new, open, enthusiastic culture around accessibility.
Cool. Alice, can you tell us a bit about your background and interest in accessibility, and then your role at AbilityNet?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, I'm Alice. I'm an accessibility consultant at AbilityNet. So my role now is predominantly helping companies make their products and services more accessible and more usable for everyone. So I do this through doing audits of websites against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, as well as doing design reviews and wireframe reviews, as well as training to kind of help people have a better understanding of how to make products accessible. But my interest, I kind of got into this position through my interest in web development. So my role before this, I was a front-end developer, and I got interested in accessibility through kind of wanting to write better code and wanting to make the websites I was building more usable for everyone, and wanting to make designs kind of usable across any sort of device. So yeah, that's my background.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to pick up on something that's mentioned in the questions here around UX, the use of jargon.
Sorry.
I think it's no. It's really interesting, and you know, that's anybody on the call who's got any questions like this, please do raise them, because of course we're so immersed in this that we probably think about it this way around. But you know, the idea that user experience 10 or 15 years ago, that didn't exist as a thing, you know, as an area of work. Obviously, the concept of user experience is something we can all understand. But the idea of user experience, I think, is putting the user at the center of the design. The other thing I was going to mention is I've noticed more customer experience. CX has started cropping up as an area, and that often brings together marketing and design and digital, you know, in another sort of a similar mix, I think. And the other thing I would mention is from I'm a marketing manager at AbilityNet. I mean, digital, it's almost irrelevant not to include digital in it now. Everything we do is broadly digital in some aspect, and the user's experience for us includes the brand as well as the way that we speak to people on the telephone, and then a huge amount of our interactions are through some form of a digital interface. So that's what we're describing, that whole sort of range of ways that we connect with customers, where the user is really the person we're thinking of in terms of their experience. And then that brings in users with different needs and different requirements. And that's where the accessibility part of it started to cross over most with UX. You know, so from the point of view of somebody like me who's been around in accessibility for longer than UX, the two things have collided and come together. So hopefully that explains a bit. So Alice, you're going to give us a few slides now around what we mean by accessible design. I think this is just going to give us some broad pictures and some ideas for people on the call to understand where we're coming from around accessibility. So could you just lead us through these, please?
Yeah, sure. So what do we mean by accessible design? Well, this kind of refers to designing with a diverse range of user needs in mind. It's also referred to as inclusive design, which is a design methodology which aims to make products and services that are more usable for as many people as possible. This encompasses both accessibility and usability. So it's the needs of users with disabilities as well as all users. So one important thing about accessible design is to allow the user to adapt the product to meet their own requirements. So what I mean by this is, on the web, accessible design is important as a website can be accessed in several different ways. So a user might be using at any device, so they might be accessing your website on a mobile phone or a tablet or a desktop computer. They might choose to adapt their own personal user preferences on their computer at an operating system level. So for example, they might change the default font size, or want to change the color of the background. Or they might be using a range of assistive technologies such as a screen reader, which this is a bit of technology which will read out the page to you, or using something like a switch device. But in any of these situations, it's important to provide a comparable experience across them and consider all of them. So with accessible design, you'd want to ensure that there's kind of no loss of content or functionality, no matter which of those devices you viewed your product on. Can you change the slide, please, Mark? So something to bear in mind is that impairments are not always permanent. So disabilities can be either permanent, temporary, or situational. So someone who has a temporary disability, such as a broken arm, for example, may experience the same barrier on a website as a user with a permanent disability, such as having one arm. But if you make a product or service that a user can adapt to meet their own needs, and it's a flexible product, then it can help address the potential barriers and create a better user experience for everyone. Next slide again, please, Mark. So I'm now going to just briefly mention some areas of design and aspects of accessible design that, if implemented, you can kind of create a better user experience for everyone. Some of them relate to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, while those are best practices, but as a designer, it's really good to be aware of them, and so they can create more inclusive and accessible designs. So the first one is responsive design. This is a if you don't know, if you've not heard of responsive design, it's a design principle which kind of aims to your design kind of adapts to a user's behaviors. So this is based on screen size. Initially, it became most popular with the increased use of mobile phones. So when people were starting to view websites on smaller screen sizes, there was a need for less of not just having a desktop view of your website, but also a mobile view of it. However, this has also really helped users with low vision, because on desktop, a user might choose to zoom in to your web page, and when they do that, the page will reflow. And being aware of this can help you design a more flexible website. You can actually prevent the reflow from happening on desktop. You shouldn't do that, because then that would mean that low vision users wouldn't have that additional benefit of having something that's been designed to work responsibly. The second one is captions on videos. So again, this can benefit users who may be hard of hearing or deaf, but captions on videos can also benefit users who may be in a situation such as on a crowded bus or in an office where they might not want to listen to the content, they might want to read the content on a video. So captions can really benefit users in many different situations. Contrast and use of colour. So originally this often talked about as text content. So the text contrast needs to be high enough in order for users to be able to read the content. However, since 2.1, which is the latest version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, this has also related to components that a user interacts with. So it's important for things like buttons, and any interactive component like a form input also meets color contrast requirements. Quite a common design situation with contrast is having text over a video or an image, which can, in these situations, like a video, for example, the background's constantly changing, so you might not be able to guarantee that contrast in all situations. However, providing high contrast does help users with low vision, but it also can help a user who might be using a mobile phone in bright sunlight outside. So designing inclusively can help benefit a range of users. It's also important to consider the use of icons across a website. So if you look at the examples on the right, like the explore and the saved and the login icons, without that text, it might not necessarily be clear to a user what those icons refer to. And also, if you were to use, say, the explore icon on a different page, it's important that that icon has the same meaning across different pages, so that a user can associate that meaning with what that is showing. And then finally, states of icons. So, states of components. So when designing inclusively, it's kind of important to make sure the states are defined. So if you look at the bottom example, it's got the inactive state of the buttons, but this needs to be clear visually as well as programmatically for assistive technology users. So it might be clear visually that those are inactive, but if that hasn't been communicated programmatically, then not all users may know that those buttons are actually inactive.
Can I just ask a couple of questions there, Alice? They're really helpful
sure.
points. The contrast, for those people who aren't familiar with it, is something you can actually measure, of course, that putting two colours next to each other is something you can go and measure. So how, in your role as a consultant, how frequently do you see colour contrast as an issue?
Fairly frequently. Text contrast is getting better, but component contrast is definitely something that it can be missed as kind of, it's not just like for an input, for example, it's about the kind of boundary of that input against the background. So anything that the user can interact with, that color contrast is important. One thing that is like a common problem, for example, is that a company might say that it's their brand colors, and the brand colors are the thing that is like they need to have their brand colors. What can they do about it? But there's a really good resource, I can't remember what it's called, Contrast Finder, I think, that it allows you to put in your brand colors, for example, and it will give you a hex value, which is an accessible version of your brand color. So it's as close to your brand color as it can be, but it can be like a web version of it.
Great. Actually, somebody's mentioned here, Matthew's mentioned a WebAIM study of 1 million websites found that 86.3% had low contrast. So this is a really big problem. I think that's why I flagged it up. I think particularly from a design point of view, people will not, as you say, they may not be starting with colors that they've chosen. They may have to decide what to do with the colors that they've been given. And of course, the other thing is that we've put black text on white backgrounds here. You may be starting with a brand color, which is it's better with white on that background than black or some other color. So the contrast doesn't mean that you have to put particular colors together. It just means you have to consider that and then measure it to make sure that there is sufficient contrast. And there are a number of ways around that. And
it's also all text as well. So like for instance, copyright notices in the footer, and like even things that you might think are not important to, like, they all need to meet those color contrast requirements. Yeah. And I think it's worth saying, for those of you not familiar with this, when we do testing, we can test at a code level because you can see the colors because they're specified in the HTML or in the website itself. You can see the colors and you can measure two colors against each other using those numbers. So we have a piece of software that runs across a website, and we'll look at the colors that you have sitting on top of each other. And we'll immediately say whether or not that's contrast is sufficient. So that, for those of you not familiar with it, that's a really easy test to run. We can see that straight away when we're doing our testing. And you can go and have a look online. There's various resources. If you look up color contraster, we'll put some links into the program notes as well. But you can do that straight away. So from a design point of view, you can start with something that you know is going to be sufficient contrast and then use it all the way through. Whereas we often see it after that at the end of the project and point out that those two colors are not going to go together and you might have to go back and redesign it. So part of that is about the process and how you make sure you are thinking about it from the beginning. I also just wanted to mention a personal one with video captions. It's always a real shame when somebody's bothered to put captions on but not bothered to make them readable. It's so often you see something, you can't see all the captions. It happens on the TV as well as on the web. So if you've gone to the trouble of putting captions on, and you can see we've got white captions on black background for anybody using the captions here. I mean, it's a very simple standard. It doesn't have to be clever. It doesn't have to be glamorous. It just makes it very readable. And it's an expected sort of color usage that people will find helpful rather than having to think about your own version of it. So Alice, this bit is about going back to that lesson about that it isn't just the accessibility consultant who's responsible for accessible design. Yeah, so it's definitely not one person's role. It's everyone within the team and within the process. It should be kind of thought about at the planning stage, at the content stage, all the way through to launch and after launch. It's definitely something that you kind of need to think about at every stage. Yeah. And we work with people at every stage, and an example of something that people don't expect us to be able to do is we can do accessibility testing on wireframes, because there's enough rules that we know need to be in place. And a very common one, there's a case study on our website about Barclays building an app for banking and having too many buttons on the screen. And as soon as they sketched it out and showed it to the consultant, they said, well, the buttons are going to be too small. And they said, well, we need 13 buttons because everybody's got 13 things they want to do. And they then had to work through that process and decide the 9 most important buttons, because that's how many buttons they could fit on. And that was done right at the beginning. But imagine if they'd done that at the end. And we tested it at the end and said, sorry, you got too many buttons. And they had to go right back to the beginning of the process and decide which services they were going to include. So that's a really simple example of why doing it at the beginning saves you all that time and trouble at the end. And that really is expensive. For that bank, they couldn't release it without it being accessible, and that would have been an expensive project to have redeveloped. I'm just going to mention a couple of things in here. So I'm going to pick up a couple of questions before we go on to the panel. For captions, how much opacity level is recommended for the overlay? I personally prefer no opacity, straightforward black background with white writing on it. I'm wearing my glasses now. If I'm trying to look at something on my phone and I haven't got my glasses on, they become invisible with any opacity. That's a preference, but you can actually go and check on the color contrast tools to see
how much opacity you can do before it becomes lack of contrast. But why not white on black? There's no reason not to. And then a couple of questions in here, which there's some tools about doing testing, so we won't touch on that particularly, but there is we've got a webinar about doing your own, a training course about doing your own testing. There are a few tools around. You can put a plugin called Accessibility Insights that Microsoft produces. There's also Wave, which is wave.org, I think, which can do a single page test. The professional tools we use can run across multiple pages, but you will find lots of free stuff out there that will do individual pages or maybe a small collection of pages together. So you can test 2 or 3 pages, a couple of templates of different styles of pages on your site. That's a minimum really as you're beginning to assemble your website. Accessible content, you can do a language checker. From the point of view of accessible content, we particularly think about reading age. It varies. You can set your own for your own organization. Anything from 9 to 12 is quite typical range that people might do. You can paste the content in and it will check what the reading age is. Great, so on to some discussion. So we've had a chat about this, and so what we're going to do is just try and show you some examples of what each of the panelists has seen as being accessible design and competitive advantage. We're particularly keen to focus on this area where it's not so much about the doing of it, it's the why you're doing it. What are you going to get out of this? What's the outcome for the organization? And a lot of this is really saying that COVID situation has really brought to the surface that you have lots of customers out there that you might not have been thinking about, whether you're a business or a charity or a public organization. The people who are trying to use your services are now much more likely to be using them digitally because they can't literally turn up and make use of them. We were looking at universities the other day. A lot of disabled students have been able to go into the lecture theatre and talk to the lecturer, get access to the notes, or try and clarify something that they couldn't actually access before. Now they're working from their homes. They have to try and do all of that electronically, and suddenly they're feeling a lot more excluded. So it's a very simple example of the need for accessibility in the day-to-day work of the university that probably they could have skirted around a little bit before. So we're going to start with you. This is Sarah, isn't it? No, Emily. Alice, sorry. Just think about booking a flight. Sorry, Alice. Can you tell us a bit about why we've picked up these 3? We've got EasyJet here, British Airways and Ryanair. So with your accessibility consultant hat on, how do these things look to you in terms of advantages for the user and the business is concerned?
Well, looking at these, if you look at the British Airways one, it's a very clear interface of, it's quite clear that that is where you input the information about the flight you want to go on. When using a keyboard, it's quite easy to get through. You can kind of open things up. It's quite intuitive to use. And you can see that search button on the right, it's actually in an inactive state until you've filled out all the required fields that you need in order to search for that flight. Looking at the EasyJet one on the left, again, it's got quite a clear interface on the left to kind of show what you need to fill out in order to search your flight. This one also has a carousel on it. However, there is a play pause button on it. So if a user doesn't want to see the information rotating, they can pause it. The one on the right is Ryanair. This one, it was harder to use with a keyboard interface. So kind of tabbing through and trying to put in the information was not as intuitive as the British Airways one. This one also had a carousel underneath it, which was auto playing. So, and there wasn't a way for it to pause it. So this might be quite distracting for a user who might have gone to the site to kind of search for a flight, but then there's actually a carousel underneath, which is distracting them from what they wanted to do.
Thank you. I mean, I think when we were looking at this, it's worth mentioning that you know, these companies are all in exactly the same business. They're all just making it as easy as possible for you to search for a flight and book them. There are 3 different ways of doing that, really. And certainly the British Airways one has put it center stage and said, here you go, we think you want to do this. We've made it as easy as possible for you to do it. Just in terms of how it's presented, that's true. And then what we're saying about the programming and the design of those elements and the components has just been done very elegantly. It's very easy and straightforward to use. It's announcing things if you're using a screen reader and so on. Those are under the bonnet, but they're clearly part of the design that they've started with. And they've clearly got in mind that they want to make this as easy as possible for anybody to book a flight. And that's quite striking when you see the difference between them being played out on the screen. And an easy thing for you to do if you do go to a website and wonder about it, pressing the tab, try and follow the logic through the pages. Sometimes you'll find it goes to the obvious starting point. Sometimes you find yourself jumping around in all the menus and not really following the logic of the page. And that's a very simple example of the design of that interface, which would be nothing to do with what it looks like, but wholly to do with how it performs for certain people. Alice, in terms of using tab order, who might that affect in terms of people thinking about their customers? Which of their customers might be using tab and why?
So yeah, not all users will be using the mouse. If a keyboard user may want to, like, they may not be able to use the mouse. So being able to tab through all the content and being able to open up, like, I think each of them had a date picker on them, being able to open up that date picker and select the right date using a keyboard is very important. Keyboard accessibility is kind of the underlying thing that a lot of assistive technologies rely on. So, for example, a screen reader user would may also navigate the page using the tab key or by using the arrow keys. So ensuring that your site works with keyboard alone is pretty important.
Cool. Got a useful question here. I'm just going to mention about carousels. Are all carousels bad? I mean, there's other questions here about slideshows, but carousels, that they fall into both good and bad, I think, and then sometimes a grey area in between. But just to emphasise your point on the EasyJet carousel, there is a multiple sort of image there that you can go through, but you can control it with the keyboard. You can make it stop and start, whereas the one on Ryanair, you can't stop and start it. It just has a scroll over and over and over, just in a loop, and there's no way of making that pause. So that very simple difference between them, forget about what they look like and all the other bits, which may have other reasons why we would choose to use one and not the other, but simply being able to pause it and control it. That's a piece of code that you have to build into your carousel when you're making it. Once you've built a carousel that you can do that, you can put anything you like into it as long as the customer can actually control the movement through it. And that's a good example of the design and the programming working together. So you can still make your splashes and you can still do the design what you want to do, but you've made it possible for somebody to pause that so that they don't get distracted or because they can't control it any other way. So that's a good example of a carousels are not by definition bad. It's simply the way that they're presented that can improve its accessibility. Emily, you're going to talk about ASOS and Boohoo, which I think you looked at. So tell us what you liked and didn't like about these two.
Yeah, so I guess e-commerce and online shopping, especially for fashion, kind of have a bit of a bad rep for sometimes not looking at accessibility. They are quite well known for maybe having ignored it in the past. But what I really loved, I think we've jumped the slide.
Sorry, I've jumped. Sorry, that was my mouse.
I'm so excited. So what was really nice about ASOS, which is a screenshot that we can see on the left. Sorry, I had to pause that. I'm not very good at my left and right on the left. Is that you can skip to content straight away when you're using tab, like when you're tabbing through the site, and it's throughout it's really clear where the focus is actually, which is nice. As you tab through, there's a clear outline and clear contrast between like the focus state basically. Also, when you are using a screen reader and keyboard only, it's really quite easy to navigate the site and to go to the clothing areas you want, to set filters, to sort it. And the tab order is pretty much what you'd expect. And I think there's that idea of, you know, designing and building a website to work the way a user would expect it to, not designing it any fancy old way and completely subverting people's expectations. You know, don't try and reinvent the wheel. You can just follow those expectations, and it makes things a lot easier. So when I was going through ASOS, I was able, using a screen reader and keyboard only, I was able to get to a product listing for jeans, and I was able to set my size, and I was able to go onto the product. So pretty much, I didn't go as far as the basket, etc., but I could even favorite things, so there wasn't any reduction, or I didn't have a lesser experience because I was using assistive tech. If you hold this up against pretty much any other well-known kind of fashion site, and my example here is Boohoo, and I'm not going to tear Boohoo apart, that's not the intention at all by any means, but the issue I did face there is that I got lost immediately. The focus disappeared, there was no skip to content, I was just confused, I didn't know where I was, and when I tried it out with a screen reader and keyboard only, it turns out you can't actually navigate via keyboard. I got stuck after like the first tab or second tab. I couldn't get past the home page, so I was stuck on the home page. The reason I put these together is, yes, they're quite clearly, like, they're selling the same things. They probably are targeted towards similar demographics. They both have visually appealing sites, but, you know, ASOS have really overcome that obstacle, or maybe they probably don't even see it as an obstacle, and actually built a site that can be used by anyone no matter what, and they've not had to make any big sacrifices in doing that. They're very similar sites, but one is accessible and one isn't, and the one that is accessible is going to be able to serve people who need to use assistive tech, or maybe they don't need to use assistive tech but they just need to tab through the site, whatever it might be. They're catering for a whole group of people that deserve to be catered for. They shouldn't be an afterthought.
Great, thank you. And I've been to meetups, in accessibility meetups, when the professionals are getting together, and I know that there is quite an extensive team in ASOS that do accessibility, so it's not a coincidence, and that they'll have embedded that best practice into their team. They were talking about having done that for a few years, so this isn't a coincidence that they've managed to do that. That isn't how we teed it up, of course. We chose those two and looked at them, but it is a team that we know have been working in that space for some time. So Sarah, you work with a bunch of people in all sorts of different roles, and one of the questions that a lot of people ask is how do you get people along this journey? What, you know, in terms of you worked for guide dogs, you've sat next to people using assistive tech. How do you get your teams to really sort of pick up this and understand the need to bring this across every project in every stage?
I think it really depends on the kind of group of people you've got, the level of knowledge they have, and kind of what kind of how they've been subjected to this information before. Because one thing I have noticed over the years is a lot of people, unless they're working in that specific environment, they've not come across anyone that's had to use assistive technology. They've not been emerged in that kind of that environment. So understanding the need for all of these things, it's, for a lot of people, it's never crossed their mind. So for me personally, in terms of education, I think it's best to try and bring people along with you rather than trying to enforce people to take on this desire to make things accessible. And there's been certain ways. There are online tools in which to do this. So for example, you were talking about accessibility insights, the Chrome plugin, and I've found that personally really useful in terms of showing people page structure. So bringing up how the heading tags and things like that are appearing on a particular website, and just showing people how potentially this is how your website looks, this is how it should look. Funkify, which we've got up there on the slide, Funkify is a great introduction to people that identifies different abilities and really shows people how somebody else might experience your website. So it has two versions. One's a premium version, which unfortunately you have to pay for, but they do have a free version which takes you through different abilities. So you've got somebody with dyslexia, and it shows you how potentially a person with dyslexia may see your site. You've got color contrast issues, so people with different color blindness. It shows how they may be viewing certain areas of your site, and then it takes you through the kind of different site impairments, and takes you through, you know, if you had different site impairments, it gives you different ideas of how people might be viewing your content. So something like Funkify is a great way to say to somebody, right, you don't know what I'm talking about, but you want to find out more. This is what somebody else might be experiencing. And so for an online tool, it actually works quite well. Something that has also worked for me alongside the tool like Funkify is this 13 days of accessibility. So the WCAG guidelines, so I always forget what the C stands for. Website Content Accessibility Guidelines.
Web Content Accessibility Guidelines.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the WCAG guidelines, they're kind of an industry standard of accessibility that goes up in varying degrees of compliance. So it goes from an A up to a AAA. So these guidelines, when viewed just online, they can be a really intimidating resource. And if somebody says to you, right, you've got to go off and make your website A or AA or AAA compliant, you see this massive list, and all of a sudden it's mind-blowing. And this website, I found this a while back, and it's called 13 Days of Accessibility, and it breaks down the WCAG guidelines into 13 manageable chunks, and it provides each section with a checklist. So it says, right, okay, if you're going single A compliant, this is what you need to do to your website. If you're going AA, this is what you need to do, AAA, and so on and so forth. So it takes you through those 4 key pillars of accessibility, breaks it down into the 13, and then breaks it down further into each individual checkpoint. So even if, like we were saying before, even if you're not the only person responsible for accessibility, you can then bring back-end developers on board to look at what areas they could potentially fix. You can bring on the designers and say, right, okay, so we need to be able to do this. And that as a resource is actually really quite helpful. And I found one offline tool that has been invaluable, certainly to me, is involving charities in this entire accessibility journey. So for example, I know from past experience, guide dogs have volunteers that will go out to organizations, and you know, you could use web accessibility as the key topic of conversation. So for example, I brought in a guide dog owner into one of our monthly marketing meetings, and it just brought it to life to people. People finally understood why I'd been banging on about accessibility for so long, because there's a human being there that you know, that this impacts on, and you know, he talked through how it impacted on him. So using real life resources, I think, are amazing. And I think at this time, charities, you know, they are suffering in the current situation. So I think getting those on board in any way that you can for accessibility purposes is amazing.
Great, thank you. And I think you know, that we're all going to be working in different settings, and I can see some of the questions, you know, that we'll all have different knowledge and technical knowledge. And I think there's a couple of important lessons here, that it won't just be one person. Somebody's asking, what do I need to get my teams to do? I really like the first stage is really to understand why you're doing it. As much of that as you can do as possible. That the Funkify does that really nicely, because you actually see the results of your own work already. If you pull up your own website and have a look at what it looks like for somebody who's got tunnel vision, that's one of the settings on it, I know, and the dyslexia one makes the page wobble because the text is too complicated. Those sorts of things, they really bring it to life. And then somebody may know someone with dyslexia. They may have some experience of that themselves, and it's that personal connection which is often more important than all of the technicalities, and which change, and they depend on what you're trying to do, and they depend on how many pages you're trying to create, and depends on whether you're building a site which is very simple or whether you're trying to make that ASOS thing, trying to do that online shopping thing is really complicated. It's an incredibly complicated experience they're creating for people there. That's not being done by one person just making it up as they go along. That's a team of probably several hundred that's working on that all the time. So right at the beginning of this journey is, do you really get the reason that you're doing it? And I think a lot of work that we do as AbilityNet is really about that. It's about empathy, really, isn't it? And understanding. And then right at the other end of the process, people have mentioned this, and it may not be clear, that when you're setting a target, and Sarah said this quite quickly, and I'm just going to go back a bit more slowly. The WCAG is the set of guidelines that exist, and they're universally adopted by anybody trying to say whether a website or an app is accessible. It's a very straightforward benchmark, except that it has different stages. So you have an A, which means that you've done all right. You have a double A, which means you've done really quite well. And you have a triple A, which often involves compromises, because something in one area can't be done in another area unless you decide which one you're going to do. So when we're testing sites as AbilityNet, we'll be testing, trying to reach AA. That's pretty much what people would set as their expectation in the profession. Sometimes we'll say, look, this big part of your site is all AA, but this bit over here, you really got to go back and do some more work on it. It's not accessible. So it's a bit of a moving target when you first encounter it. There is a lot of stuff in there to learn. There's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of technical knowledge. But that's the point about moving in and getting your teams to learn this. And it isn't just a simple, oh, when you do this, everything's okay. It sort of depends which bit you're working on. And I think that the 13 days of accessibility stuff is a good example of different people in your team will get different things from that, because it sort of depends on their role and how they're working. If you're working with an external supplier and you're not sure whether they understand this, then really you should be asking about, WCAG AA would be a standard you would ask them to achieve. And then if they don't know what they're talking about, it will be very obvious straight away, because they won't be able to explain what they're going to do to achieve it. So you don't have to become a technical expert. You can understand some of the rules of engagement. Right at the beginning of this, I think, is that empathy piece, and really being clear about what you're trying to achieve here for your users, all your users, making it easy for all of them to use your services. Alice, just a quick one, really. There's a couple of questions in here about coding versus design.
Yep.
In your experience, because you're looking at websites all the time for our customers, how much of what you're looking at is sort of on the surface, and how much of it is inside the website, where the problem is actually the way that it's coded? Literally, like your components. There's a question about the components, particularly when you mentioned them.
That's a good question. There's a lot of accessibility is, for want of a better word, invisible on, like, it's in the code. So for example, alt text, a designer, that's added by a content editor. So there are a lot of considerations for designers on the surface of kind of creating an uncluttered design and ensuring color contrast and ensuring that it works responsively, and the things I mentioned earlier. But then there are also a lot of things for developers to consider, like when they actually come to building the actual components and how they should operate, and how an assistive technology user would expect it to work. So for example, like a common component is an accordion, where it shows and hides content, but that needs to be built in a certain way that it works as a keyboard user would expect it, and it announces in a way that a screen reader user would know that that is what that design pattern is. I think, yeah, it's definitely across, there are a lot of things in the code that need to be considered. There are a lot of things in the design as well as content that's being created and added. So yeah, it's across everything.
And it's a moving target, I think it's fair to say, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
You create a page one day and the next day somebody doesn't put any alt text on an image, and essentially you've knocked back. So we're getting a lot of conversations in here about learning and training, and it's worth mentioning that AbilityNet does training, other people do as well. And I think that's the point, is that this is an ongoing process. I've just wanted to ask about, you know, the time and effort you're investing in a professional sense and the advantage it's bringing you. Emily and Sarah in particular, you know, you work in big teams. Is accessibility something you think is going to become a career advantage increasingly in the future?
I think.
Go on,
Sorry.
Sarah, you go ahead.
I was going to say, from my perspective, obviously coming from the sight loss sector, it was something that was embedded. But speaking to people more, even in the last 12 months, I've heard people saying how they're seeing more requirements for even just a base knowledge of accessibility requirements. And personally, I'd like to think that it does become one of those things that it's a given that people appreciate why something needs to be accessible, and that they know even just the basics. You know, Alice, you were saying about alt text, even just the basics of putting your alternative text on your images, your heading tags, the meaningful hyperlinks, just as long as people know even just the basics, I think that could give you a competitive edge. And I think certainly for me, it's always been one of those things that I will, when I'm doing any kind of competitor analysis, and if someone says to me, oh, I think so-and-so's made a better website than we have, blah, 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 I'll always go on and just double check for the first thing. Have they done the basics right? Have they made the basic stuff accessible? Because I think it's really key that you can recognize that and that you share it and that everyone is aware that it's something that needs to be done. So I've used it in interviews before where I've taken along almost like an accessibility audit of somebody's website. Just the basics, looking at your hyperlinks and forms, making sure that the form labeling is correct and that the error messages appear correctly. And so, yeah, for me, I think it will start to become certainly a growth area, like you're saying, where people are relying more on online resources. It has to be, and with the big tech companies picking it up and using it on mobile phones and things like that, you know, it can only improve, especially with the quick increase of the use of voice technology, where that's kind of blown up and as quickly as it has.
And Emily, I think you were saying, you know, specifically, it's been a step up for you in terms of your work. This UX thing, isn't it? Is that user experience morphing into something a little bit more niche and specialist, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, generally speaking, just taking a step back, I went to an event the other week and it was an accessibility meetup in Manchester, and people's job titles, you could start to see that some people had like lead dev, like lead developer and accessibility consultant or something like that. And you're starting to see this maybe two roles or merging, and you are starting to see more companies who have accessibility in-house, and that's definitely grown throughout the last few years. And then talking personally from my perspective, I came into MoneySupermarket and that's where I started my UX career. So I was an associate, it was all self-taught before that, and then they really helped me grow and develop, and I kind of said, you know, I really want to look at accessibility and designing inclusively. And I actually not long ago got promoted, and one of the reasons listed for my promotion was that I was an advocate for accessibility and inclusion. So it really does show that companies are caring more about maybe that approach or that culture or that desire to be inclusive of everyone. We have it as a group behaviour to create belonging, and that can be internal or external, that can be for your users or that can be for your colleagues. So yeah, and I think that if whether you're a UX designer, content creator, product manager, if you're willing to embed and integrate and add accessibility into your day-to-day tasks, but also do some of the bigger projects like trying to increase awareness around accessibility, it shows that you're willing to go the extra mile, that you're not just doing the standard, you're actually saying those standards aren't good enough, I want them to be better for those around me, for the people who are buying my products, whoever it might be. And you want to be inclusive of all people, and companies are starting to get that. like employers are starting to get it, but I think even consumers are starting to see it. You know, you see people talking about boycotting companies or whatever it might be nowadays. The consumer also has more of a moral compass, or is more willing to look into the morals of a company when they're purchasing with them. So yeah, I think in terms, sorry, that was such a broad answer. I answered like different areas, but yes, accessibility definitely can have a huge, like that knowledge can definitely have a huge impact on your personal career development, on your professional career development, and also just in the wider scale of things. I think we're just seeing a trend towards accessibility in-house, and just kind of everywhere, which is great.
Great, thank you. I think I just want to finish off a couple of things. Certainly we were talking the other day, somebody really quite senior in a very big tech company was saying that internally they're seeing this as a social justice issue and not a technology issue, which was really interesting. And the other one about diversity, the idea of diversity being a theme a couple of years ago would have been odd, but you're seeing diversity across, people are embedding diversity in their advertising. It obviously works for them to be seen to be diverse. And on the back of that, you need to be diverse in actually what you do, and you need to be able to deliver services that people can use. And that's really the hook, I think. It's easy to do. Some of the diversity issues are about who you show in your adverts. Some of them are about whether people can buy things from you. And sooner or later, if people haven't thought about accessibility of their services, then the people you're aiming at are not going to be able to buy things from you. I think that's the ingredient we're thinking about. So we'll come to the end now. Thank you so much, Alice, Emily, Sarah. I think that's a huge range of subjects we've covered. It really just exposed how much is there in terms of this accessibility subject. It's really interesting for those of you who've joined us just to see the range of questions you've asked us. We will do our best to do some roundups and publish them onto the website afterwards. There are some questions there that we can answer directly. Others that are maybe a little bit harder to do, we'll do what we can around that. But also worth mentioning that we have training, and if this is the first time you've encountered accessibility, you'll see that this isn't a 60-minute subject. You don't go away with everything intact. There's plenty in there for you to dig a bit deeper into. We're doing accessibility for designers, which is a 90-minute session which Alice leads, and which is specifically looking at some of those specific lessons in a smaller group, a training session. That's available in November, the next time we're running it. We've got a load of other training as well, including things like how to do your own testing that I've mentioned. Anybody who's in the HE or public sector, there's regulations that are very specifically apply now to public sector around accessibility. Don't really apply in the same way in the private sector, but the public sector has very clear responsibilities to be doing things on a set timetable. So the next big deadline is the 23rd of September. We've got a webinar next week for anybody in that sector looking at accessibility statements, which you must have up to scratch by the 23rd of September. So that's a very specific issue for some of you, depending on which sector you're in. And then we've also got, as I mentioned, we've got services that you can see if you look on our website and under the accessibility services section. There's all sorts of things that we've mentioned today that we may be able to help you with, or there may be resources that we've listed because we do those services. I mentioned wireframe reviews, being able to test your wireframes. There's lots of advice and information around that type of thing on the internet. If that's where you are in the process and you're typically trying to pull wireframes together, then you'll find lots of resources on the internet about how to test those using some of the most common tools. And then equally, we do training in those sorts of things as well. So thank you, everyone. If you have any more questions, please just use the questions box now, and we'll do our best to answer those after the session. Thank you again, Alice, Emily, Sarah, for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on another webinar in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Going to close it. When I close this, we're all going to disappear. So just so you know.